As the state's fiscal picture worsened in recent years, environmental funding was often the first to feel the budget axe, or even worse, to see cash that was earmarked for green projects swept away to help close deficits. But this year was actually different. While other groups were howling over Governor Andrew Cuomo's proposed budget cuts, environmentalists were quietly praising the governor for proposing that EPF funding remain stable at $134 million. The Departments of Environmental Conservation and Parks were spared some staff funding cuts as well. That's welcome news to advocates like Rob Moore. He is the Executive Director of Environmental Advocates of New York. Rob, thanks very much for your time.
Yeah, great to be here, Liz.
So you guys fared pretty well. You may be one of the few people who can actually say that.
Well, it's a relative measurement. I mean,
Sure.
There's a lot of pain to be spread around in this budget and past years. And as you said before, environmental programs and environmental agencies were often the first to feel the cut of budget reductions, and were the victims, I think, of by far the steepest budget cuts of any aspect of state government.
Yeah, well, the EPF, it's actually the Environmental Protection Fund. Just explain briefly what it is for everybody who might not know.
Yeah, the Environmental Protection Fund was set up in 1993. It's basically a fund to help support capital investments, whether it's land acquisition, parks facilities, recycling programs in municipalities throughout the state,
Right.
A whole slew of things, municipal parks programs, municipal forestry programs. EPF, the Environmental Protection Fund, touches on every county in New York State.
And it's funded through?
Basically, it's funded from revenues of the state real estate transfer tax. There's
Right.
some other minor sources of revenues that go into the Environmental Protection Fund as well.
And that's actually been doing fairly well. I mean, the real estate transfer tax does better when people transfer real estate. And so
Exactly,
when the
right.
economy does well, then there's more money available.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And the Environmental Protection Fund only receives a small portion of the overall real estate transfer tax revenues. It's not the sole beneficiary of those, so that's also important to remember.
So this is a fund that it's almost like too tantalizing for state lawmakers. They just can't help themselves. When there is, we call this one-shots, right? When there is a budget deficit to be closed, they look around and they see these pots of money sort of sitting there, and arguably, while it's very important for the environment, of course, it's not crucial to the health and safety, like, say, police officers, you might argue. So they see these pots of money and they take them and they use them to plug budget holes, and then you never get the money back.
Yeah, that's essentially correct. It's important to remember, though, that the legislature is not the ones who typically come up with the ideas.
Right,
Sweeping
it's
these
usually the
funds.
governor, sure.
Those are ideas that are usually proposed in the executive budget proposal, and the legislature has to react to that. And because of the constraints placed by the state constitution on how the budget is actually set, the legislature has a fair amount of wiggle room, but doesn't have all the wiggle room it always wants in these areas.
So this budget has proposed keeping the EPF flat at $134 million, which is what it was last time. And we should note that actually that's quite a bit further down than it used to be. So it's not like you're rolling in dough necessarily. It's just not a huge cut from years past.
That's correct. It allows the environmental programs to maintain the same level of effort that they've had over the last couple of years. So
Right.
That's a real step forward from where we've been in the last couple of years, which have been steep cuts, both the Environmental Protection Fund and also the operating expenses and staff expenses
Yeah.
at agencies
DEC.
like the Department of Environmental Conservation,
Sure.
Office of Parks as well. We've also seen very deep cuts in the past 2 years.
Well, that was, I mean, it also saw some controversy. I mean, that was the issue that sparked the memo, the infamous memo that maybe Pete Granis did or did not leak, but I mean, that ended up in his firing, the former commissioner of the DEC. So people have been talking about the DEC. I mean, seriously, since I got here 15 years ago, there has been concern over the staffing levels at DEC and the ability to do critical things like inspect dams, for example, and manage all this open space that the state acquires needs to be managed at some point.
That's correct. Department of Environmental Conservation has lost hundreds of staff over the last 15 years, and those staff losses became particularly acute over the last 2 years. They lost about 20% of their staff, I think, over the last two budget cycles, and no other agency has seen that type of hemorrhaging of experience, of knowledge, and just manpower going out the door. And the DEC, I think they took in the last round of layoffs that Governor Patterson executed on his way out the door, DEC lost about 17% of the overall layoffs, despite the fact that they make up less than 0.22%, less than 1/4% of general revenue spending in the state budget.
Have you guys had an opportunity yet to meet the DEC commissioner that the governor has selected?
Well, I had lunch with Joe Martens before he was nominated,
Right.
so I don't know if that counts or not.
Right.
I haven't sat down with the commissioner, the acting commissioner, Joe Martens. Looking forward to doing that. We've had several conversations with other members of the administration about the needs of the agency, the needs of environmental protection efforts more generally, and some of the things that they should be pursuing, both with the legislature through the budget and also on the policy front about how we direct environmental programs.
But
going
he's a
forward.
known entity, so most people in the community feel fairly comfortable with him because he's one of you, more or less.
Well, Joe is a superlative choice to lead the Department of Environmental Conservation through what's going to be a tremendously difficult time. It's an agency that's down to its lowest staffing levels in over 20 years, and yet it hasn't seen any of its responsibilities pulled back. It also has a real resource restriction. Even though it's not seeing cuts this year, it's still suffering from cuts made under the Patterson administration and preceding administrations as well.
Right.
So it's really limited in many important ways. For instance, they actually perform 94% fewer, they do 94% fewer water quality samples than they did 15 years ago. So that means when they go inspect a facility, whether it's a sewage treatment plant or a chemical manufacturing facility, there's actually not money in the state budget any longer for inspectors to conduct their own monitoring of what's being discharged to the state's lakes and streams. That's a big problem.
Yeah, oh yeah.
There's a lot of different examples like that of how the DEC's operations have been hindered because of budget reductions.
So what will you, since you're not going to be lobbying to replace money that you didn't lose, what will you be focused on for this legislative session?
Well, I think there's several things still that we would like to see still get addressed in the budget. There's a few other small pieces of funding I think we'd like to see get restored. We'll be talking with the legislature about that. But I think one thing that really stands out, that quite frankly, I just think the administration, given the very short timelines they have when you're coming into office to put together a comprehensive 130 plus billion state budget, is reforms of brownfields tax credits. There were some minor reforms made in 2008 that allowed brownfield tax credits to flow to the areas where they're most needed. However, those reforms really didn't go far enough. So you're seeing communities that are largely minority communities, communities with high levels of poverty, high levels of unemployment, aren't seeing the benefits of cleaning up old industrial sites and seeing them subsequently redeveloped and put to economic use.
So there's still some things for you to do. You won't be able to take a vacation for the rest of this session, is what you're
No,
saying?
we will
Okay.
certainly not be sitting this session out. It's going to be a very busy budget year, even for constituencies like us who didn't see the extent of the cuts this year that some other places did.
Well, Rob Moore, I want to thank you very much for joining us to talk to us about this. It's been fun.
Great. Thanks a lot, Liz.